Hello, and welcome to the B78 Endurance Hub weekly webinar series. I'm Jasper Blake. I'm the head coach at the B78 Endurance Hub. And if you've been joining us for the last few weeks, hopefully the information's been valuable. If you're a first timer, that's cool too. The purpose of these webinars really is just to give you a baseline of knowledge and information about endurance sports. We welcome any feedback in regards to what topics we can cover. Um, but hopefully, you come away from these really with just a clearer sense of what the sport's all about. A large part of our focus is the sport of triathlon. But we do, of course, get into cycling and running, and there's lots of crossover between those sports, both in terms of the training required for them, but also in terms of people actually doing them. So hopefully you get some really good knowledge from these. And if you're a veteran in the sport, some of this stuff is going to seem really basic. If you're a beginner and just getting into it, I think a lot of this stuff will be very useful for you. So today's topic, triathlon and what distances there are. Now, this might seem kind of basic, even if you are a veteran of the sport, you might be surprised to learn some of the stuff I'm going to cover today. It's not exactly straightforward. There's a whole bunch of different branches in the sport of triathlon. It's really evolved in the last 30, 40 years. In the grand scheme of sport, it's a very new sport. Really, its debut at the Olympic Games was in 2000. Prior to that, we're probably 20, 30 years. So probably in the late 70s, this sport really got going. So, in the grand scheme of sport, it's very, very young. If you consider other sports like, tennis or golf or football, all those sports are heading into their, hundred year anniversaries. Triathlon really 40-ish years is probably 40, 50 years that it's been around. And really exploded, obviously, in the last 20 years. The Olympic Games was a big part of that. It really brought a larger audience into the fold. And of course, the big brand Ironman, which is, the industry leader really in our sport. And it's really expanded across the globe, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. So today we're going to cover a bunch of information about what distances there are. And I think this is useful for people because sometimes you might hear about a race and not really understand like how far the people are going. And likewise, you might want to sign up for a race, but you're not really sure, what what the distances are, and that really certainly should be guiding a part of the guiding part of how you pick a race. So the events I'm going to cover today, and we're going to go and keep it really simple. We're just going to go through them. I'm going to give you the distances, maybe some rough timelines of how long that takes, sort of the top people versus the more average Joes, and we'll go from there. So we're going to cover Ironman. We're going to cover half Ironman, which is also known as 70.3 now. We're going to cover 5150s. If you're new to the sport, you may not know what that is, but I'll explain it. We're going to cover Olympic or standard distance, sprint distance races, super sprints, long distance world championships. Now, I will clarify what that means, but that's just a longer type of triathlon. And I declare it as the world championships, and I'll explain why when we get to that page. Likewise, the duathlon world championships, and then we have Xterra and off-road triathlon events. We have ultra distance triathlon events, and now fairly new, probably in the last decade, we have aquathlon. I don't even know how to say that. I've been doing this sport for like 30 years. I'm not sure how to say that. And aqua bike, and they're fairly new, and I'll give some context around what those are about. Okay, so Ironman, this is the one that I'm going to start here because I think this is the one that most people are familiar with. It's such a huge brand. It's an incredible brand. It's really exploded in the last 10 to 15 years. Certainly a global brand. I think most people know what this is because it gets lots of publicity. In the early days, it was covered on networks like NBC. And it had some incredibly huge moments that really helped define and launch this sport into into where it is now. Really epic moments, people crawling to the finish line, and it's very grueling event. But most people will know Ironman. It's to this day one of the only brands that I ever see people tattooing on themselves regularly. People are very proud of this accomplishment. It's not just the pros who tackle this; it's everybody and anybody, and it really is a very grueling race. And I think it's a bucket list race for a lot of people. It's something that they feel very proud if they can tick it off of a life list. Certainly a very big accomplishment. So the swim portion of Ironman is 3.9 kilometers or 2.4 miles. The bike portion is 180 kilometers or 112 miles. And the run portion is 42 kilometers or 26.2 miles, which you may also know as standard marathon distance. So at the pointy end of this sport, the pointy end of Ironman, the fastest athletes in the world are going anywhere from about 7.5 to 8.5 hours, and that's both the men and the women. Um, very, very fast. If you kind of do a rough calculation in your head, this is not a leisurely stroll for 7.5 or 8.5 hours. They're really, really pushing the pace, and it takes a long, long time to become fit enough to really push the pace on this. Most people who sign up for Ironman, they may have a time goal, but really one of the biggest goals is just to get to the finish line. Um, and at the other end of the race, you'll have athletes right up to 17 hours. Usually that's the cutoff. So in the old days, they used to start these events at 7 a.m. And you had until midnight to finish. And beyond that, they officially did not declare you an Ironman. You had to be under the cutoff time. It was quite ruthless. And often you get people, they had a mile to go and they're sort of doing 10-minute miles, and they have 9.5 minutes to do it, and nothing really compares to the finish line of an Ironman when you've got somebody who's just maybe going to make the cutoff. People really rally for them. It's quite an inspiring thing to watch. So Ironman, one of the more popular brands, and that is the distances that you go. So moving down in distance from there, we have half Ironman, or what they have branded it as 70.3. Now 70.3, you'll see, is the distance made up in miles. So if you add the miles of the swim and the bike and the run, you end up with 70.3. I should make sure that that's actually accurate. 56 plus 13 is 69.1, 79.1. Yeah. Did I get that right? 70.1, 70.3. That's right. um, the swim portion of a half Ironman or a 70.3 is 1.8 kilometers or 1.2 miles. The bike is 90 kilometers or 56 miles, and the run is 21 kilometers or 13.1 miles. And again, the fastest athletes in this sport are under 4 hours for sure. And at the other end of it, it's basically usually about half of a full Ironman, so maybe 7 or 8 hours at the other end of the race. And again, this is another big accomplishment for people. If you're out for 6, 7, 8 hours doing something, there's a lot of pride in that, and there should be. It's a lot of hard work to get there, and it's a big day when people do it, and it's pretty inspiring. Again, Ironman events, 70.3 and Ironman events are truly global now. There's races everywhere. So another event you might come across that's not, quite as popular or widespread is called an Ironman 5150. It's not actually an Ironman; it's just owned by Ironman brand. So I wanted to be specific about that. So the 5150 event is, again, if you just add up the numbers, but this time in kilometers, if you go 40K bike, 10K run, that's 50 plus a 1.5K swim, you're at 5150. So again, the swim distances on this are 1.5 kilometers or 0.9 miles, 40K bike or 24.8 miles, and 10K run or 6.2 miles. Now, the fastest end of this, we're going to get into Olympic distance racing in the next slide, I believe. But at the faster end of this, athletes certainly under 2 hours, and then all the way back, 3, 4 hours to complete this length of event. So, the next slide here is Olympic or standard distance. So it's important to understand the basically the biggest players in the sport of triathlon. Ironman, of course, which is the one I've talked about first, is definitely the biggest brand in our sport. But on the other side of it is sort of the national governing bodies that play under the Olympic banner. So prior to 2000, triathlon was not an Olympic sport, but we still had national governing bodies that sanctioned and put on races. And in 2000, when it came into the Olympic Games, they needed to set a standard distance. Just like if you're on a track and you're going to run a 10K, it's always 10K. So for the Olympics, they wanted to have a standard distance that athletes competed at, so that you could get specifically ready for that event. And you'll notice that the distance here is the same as the Ironman 5150 distance. Now, this type of racing definitely precedes the 5150. That's just a brand that they came up with so that they could have a shorter race offering. But this is the standard distance that they've decided will be in the Olympic Games and at World Cups for triathlon. If you're on the World Cup circuit, this is the distance that they're typically racing. Sometimes they're doing shorter stuff now, but this is the distance they're typically racing. So again, that's a 1.5K swim, a point mile or a 0.9 mile swim, 40K or 24.8 mile bike ride, and a 10K or a 6.2 mile run. Now, one thing to really clarify here, and if you ever watch the Olympic Games on the television or you've been to a World Cup event, you'll notice that the bike is a little bit different than most triathlons. Most triathlons in the bike section, you cannot draft. So that means you can't ride very closely behind another rider. It's a big advantage to do that. But when they were, getting this event into the Olympic Games, one of the challenges that races were having is that you have, say, 100 athletes on the start line in a certain age group wave or whatever. It's very difficult to spread those athletes out and have what you would call a fair race without drafting. So when the Olympics were coming and they decided that the bike portion would be draft legal, so it would behave more like a bike race, more like a crit style bike race, which is a short race that does multiple loops. I certainly remember in the late 90s, this was a huge source of controversy because there were athletes that really specialized. They had maybe their strength was swim bike. And they counted on the fact that people could not draft behind them, could not form a group of riders and move very quickly. They counted on that because maybe their strength was on the bike. So they really wanted to create some distance between them and maybe the faster runners. So when the International Triathlon Union, or the ITU, decided to make it draft legal, there was a lot of pushback from athletes that maybe didn't like that, or people that were more inclined to keep the sport the way it had been in the past, which was always non-drafting on the bike. Didn't matter where you went. They really wanted to see who was the fastest swim, bike, and runner. And to do that, they believed at the time that you should have to do those sports independently. Now, I don't really have opinion either way about that. I can see both sides. I do think the way the sport has evolved under the Olympic banner is amazing. It's super exciting. And anybody who says that you can ride an Olympic or stand, in the Olympics and be a poor bike rider, that was sort of the argument people would use, is that, oh, you don't really need to be a good bike rider. This is total nonsense. I can tell you that those athletes are incredible cyclists. They're incredible swimmers, bikers, and runners now. And it's just a different type of bike racing. It's not a straight up time trial anymore. You have to be very good in a pack. You have to have good bike handling skills. You have to have, slightly different energy system. Maybe at times the effort's very, very high, and other times you're getting some rest. So, it's just a different skill set than a straight up time trial. But make no mistake, the athletes who compete at the Olympic Games are very competent bike riders. And so I think, it did change the nature of what kind of strength you had to have on the bike. But I think it was a good thing for the sport. It's incredibly exciting to watch. And, they're finally highly tuned athletes. It's amazing. So Anyway, that's where the sport is now. We're 23 years beyond that, and I don't think people think much about it anymore. It's just the way it is. So that's just different style of racing. It's very very good. So a sprint distance event, if you ever hear that event, is basically just an Olympic distance or a 5150 cut in half. So the swim is 750 meters or 0.45 miles. The bike is 20 kilometers or 12.4 miles, and the run is 5 kilometers or 3.1 miles. And you can usually just cut that Olympic distance time in half, and then maybe it's a little bit quicker than that because it's shorter. Certainly, the best athletes in the world here, probably around 50 minutes for something like this. And if you're a newbie and you're just starting out, by the way, this is a great distance to start out with. It's probably going to take you, if you're a brand new beginner, haven't done much swim, bike, run, you're probably looking at an hour and a half or something. But it's a great distance to start with because the distances are not overwhelming. They're very manageable. It's fairly easy to train for this, in say 12 weeks. You can get yourself ready, even if you're totally new to the sport. So sprint distance, a very exciting style of racing at the high end because it's very, very fast. And yeah, it's a nice one to start with if you're a beginner. You may also hear the term super sprint distance. And again, this is just taking that sprint distance and cutting it in half, or roughly a quarter of what an Olympic distance, standard distance, or a 5150 would be. So a 375 meter swim or 0.23 miles, a 10K bike or 6.2 miles, and a 2.5K run or 1.5 miles. So we're going to get into some different types of events now. So back, many, many years ago, there were really two powerhouses in the world of triathlon. There was the Ironman brand, which has become very strong. But there's also the International Triathlon Union. And this is, more a governing body. The country federations will fall under the International Triathlon Union. So for example, Triathlon Canada kind of falls under the umbrella of the International Triathlon Union, or the ITU. And they are the ones that, if you're going to go to the Olympics, that's sort of the stream you're in. But the ITU, or the International Triathlon Union, it also has its own world championships every year. We've become most familiar with the shorter distance racing, the standard distance, because that's what's ultimately going to get people to the Olympic Games, and that's what the World Cup circuit is. But they also have a whole bunch of world championship events, and for a very long time, it still exists, but it's not as popular. Ironman kind of really has owned this space in terms of, I think, where people see value, like, or what they really want to do. Most people who are doing long distance triathlon events, they really like the Ironman brand. But the ITU, or the International Triathlon Union, still has a world championship event that you can go to. And it's kind of this weird distance in between a half Ironman and a full Ironman. So the swim on that one is 3 kilometers or 1.86 miles. The bike is 120 kilometers or 74.5 miles. And the run is 30 kilometers or 18.6 miles. And unlike the shorter distance or Olympic distance triathlon events under the ITU, this is a non-drafting event as well. So you cannot ride in packs. You have to make an effort to ride on your own. So this is the distance that they typically run for the ITU long distance world championships. Back in the day, a lot of us used to do both of the events. We used to, there was value in doing Ironman and value in doing this, and there still is. But definitely, I think Ironman, in terms of like for sponsorship and that kind of thing, it has really been the one that the athletes will focus on most. It gets a lot of airtime. It's very popular. But this one is still really neat. There's like people will go and win the ITU long distance worlds. And, in my opinion, it's still a really great thing to compete at and win if you're at that level. So let's get into this event oh gosh, these athletes are just unbelievable. There's a very small portion of the population that look at Ironman and think, gosh, I wish there was more, and I want to be challenged, for something longer. And so this event, it's taken off. The number of athletes that participate in this event is quite small. In fact, they may, I think they even cap it at say 40 athletes. Part of that is because it's a multi-day event. They can't have 3,000 people, out there with a whole, crew over 3 days in a community. It probably just wouldn't fly. So, a very small number of athletes compete in these. There is a little series, like there's Ultraman or Ultra Distance. They're called Ultraman racing, um, but Ultra Distance, events. There's a few around the world. There is one in Hawaii as well, which would be incredibly grueling because of the heat. Um, but basically, this is 320 miles over 3 days. Often you'll see some of the older pros that maybe retired from Ironman racing a few years ago. They'll tackle something like this. You've got really, really keen sort of people who are, maybe they've done Ironman. They're looking for a little bit more of a challenge. And if you're that person, this is certainly probably the right thing for you. Logistically, I think it's trickier. You have to have a team with you. There's not necessarily aid stations. Like you have to have your own group of people that really support you through this. Um, but it is a monster. So on day one, you swim 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles. And then you follow that up with a 144 kilometer or 90-mile bike. So that's day one. That's a big day. Day two, equally as big, in my opinion. You get back on the bike and you ride 276 kilometers or 172.4 miles, which is just a monster of a ride. And then on day three, you you finish it off with a double marathon or 84 kilometers, 52.4 miles. So again, you can see now why this is, a smaller event with smaller numbers. Part of it is just logistically, they have to manage that. But the other part of it is, you have to really want to do this. This isn't for everybody, but certainly if you make it through, it's a massive accomplishment. You may have heard the term duathlon. So again, usually duathlon events at the higher levels, like world championships, fall under the ITU or the International Triathlon Union banner. And the standard distance for that is usually a 10-kilometer run or 6.2 miles, and then a bike, 40 kilometers or 24.8 miles, and then a run of 5K or 3.1 miles. Now, this is the thing you'll notice right away is there's no swim portion of this. You're doing two runs. This is a really tough event. I did quite a few of these over the years, and it's hard because you start with a 10K run, and at the highest level, this goes out very, very quickly. These athletes are incredible runners usually, but also incredible cyclists. And then you have to get off and run 5K. It's a really, really, really tough event. Um, Partly because the pace you can sustain for all three of those is very, very high. So you have to be very, very fit when you do this one. Again, at the ITU World Championship sort of week, and they make it a week now because they have so many events. This will be one of the events that people take part in. So let's get into the off-road world. So again, under the ITU banner, there's the Cross Triathlon Worlds, which is basically, you may have heard the word Xterra, which is again kind of like Ironman. It's a brand, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But Cross Triathlon Worlds, looking at the website, I'm actually, I think sometimes these distances kind of, when you get into the cross or off-road world, sometimes they're at the mercy of trails and stuff, and it's sometimes not just a standard distance. They're sort of throwing at you what they've got to work with in terms of terrain. So they're a little bit different. They're a little more organic in the distances sometimes. This year at Cross Worlds, it's a 1K or 0.62 mile swim, a 20K bike or 12.4 miles. Now keep in mind that's on a mountain bike, so it usually takes much, much longer on a mountain bike, even if it's a straight up gravel road. It's just, you're just moving slower, more slowly. And certainly if it's single track or very technical riding, 20K can often take quite a bit of time. And then a 6K run or 3.7 miles. Xterra, on the other hand, I do think they try and standardize a little bit. So swims are easier to manage because you just get out there and measure the course, and in a lake, usually with loops or even just one big loop, you can get the distance you need. So 1.5K or zero point 0.9 miles, and then the bike 30 to 40K or 18.6 to 24.8 miles. And again, this will largely depend on the terrain that they're working with. If it's highly technical terrain, it'll probably be shorter because it's just going to take you longer to do it. And then a 10K or a 6.2 mile run. And again, just to clarify, Xterra is a brand, and they're a very successful brand in the off-road triathlon space. But ITU, has their own version of this, and that's just an offering that they have. The Xterra brand is great. They have their World Championships, in Hawaii, and it's pretty cool event. Okay, so the next two events are relatively new, probably in the last decade, and I there's probably a couple reasons behind it. One is to cater to people who don't necessarily like to run, and the other's to cater to people that don't necessarily like to bike. So the aquathlon, gosh, I need a lesson in how to pronounce that. The swim is 1K or 0.62 miles, and the run is 5K or 3.1 miles. This is actually a really exciting event to watch because, again, the pace is very high. So at a high level, the athletes are just storming on this one. It's like really fun to watch. They're just giving her from the gun. And then the last event we'll talk about is the aqua bike event, and I'm not really sure the reason why they got this one going, but I do hazard a guess that there's a whole lot of people out there that triathlon doesn't really work for them because running doesn't work for them. Maybe your body just can't handle the running, or running's a very hard sport on the body, and I actually think this is a really great addition to some of the events. This is just a swim and then a bike, and then you're done. So when you're finished the bike, you're finished the race. Usually a little bit longer. Um, and again, I think it's been really positive. I've met lots of people who, they couldn't really do triathlon before because the run never agreed with them. They couldn't do the training. Their body just couldn't handle it for various reasons. And that was a real barrier. And it was, kind of a bummer for them if they couldn't go to events and take part. Uh, and now with a swim bike event, they get a finisher's medal, and, they can feel proud of that accomplishment if their body can't handle the running. So, I think this has been a positive addition to things. The number of people that participate in this certainly lower than a triathlon. Um, but it's been a good thing to include. So that's it. Now, one thing I'll just quickly say is, triathlon in general has become much more standardized in terms of the distances. People like consistency. So when you go do an Ironman, it's a very specific distance, and if you do the Olympic Games, it's a very specific distance. We like that. We like to see times that make sense. But really, triathlon does have humble roots, and a lot of the grassroots events back in the day were much more random distances. Sometimes you go to a race and have an 800-meter swim, a 30K bike, and an 8K run. Um, and there was something kind of neat about that as well. You could go to different events, and different people would be stronger at slightly shorter stuff, and different people be stronger at slightly longer stuff. And there was something kind of neat about that as well. So, as an athlete kind of doing this sport or preparing for other things, I think if you have local grassroots events, in your where you live, and the distances aren't exactly the same as these, doesn't matter. It's still a triathlon. You get to work on your transitions and still go through that whole thing. And so I would encourage you to take advantage of those, smaller local races that might not fit into a tidy box. They're equally as fun and exciting, and you can push yourself. And often they're great, preparation races for maybe if you have one of these bigger ones in mind as your goal race for the year. Okay. Um, well, if there's anybody who has questions, we'll just give you a second here to punch them in there. This has been pretty straightforward, I'm sure. Um, Looks like we don't. So we'll wrap it up there today. Thanks for listening, and hopefully that gives you some context around what this sport's all about and some of the different events that are available to you. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you next week.